Hi, everyone, and welcome to Night
Hello.
School. I'm Lynn.
And I'm Christina. Hello.
And we're a part of the Nightlife team at Cal Academy in San Francisco. For those of you not familiar with Nightlife or Night School, Nightlife is our weekly Thursday night events where we mix science and creatures with a little live music and cocktails. Last year, we moved Nightlife online to join you folks at home, and we produced this little virtual baby called Night School. So every Thursday night, Christina and I will be here bringing you a new theme and some amazing presenters. And tonight we're bringing in some California Grizzlies.
And before you second guess yourself, yes, California grizzly bears are extinct. So yeah. So one of the last California grizzly bears, Monarch, actually lived in Golden Gate Park. And as a specimen, he's now part of the Academy's mammalogy collection. So tonight we have Rebekah Kim, the head Academy librarian, and she's going to give you a look into Monarch's fascinating history. And then we'll have Moe Flannery, our mammalogy collections manager, take you into the collections room for a very rare look at Monarch himself. And then a little later on, she'll also show you some extinct grizzly bear skulls. Peter Alagona is here. He's the founder of the California Grizzly Research Network, and he'll talk about why California was such a great habitat for grizzlies, what drove them to extinction, and asks if they could ever be brought back. And finally, yes, California grizzly bears were big, but were they 2,000 pounds big? Alexis Mikhailo, who's a research associate at the La Brea Tar Pits and professor of biology at Middlebury College, will investigate.
And as always, tonight's program is live, so say hi. Let us know where you're watching from. If it's your first time joining or you've been to night school before, we'll have Q&As after everyone's talk, so make sure to get your questions in the chat, and we'll pass it off to Rebekah now.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Night School. I'm Rebekah Kim, the head librarian, and I'm just going to talk a little bit tonight about the history of Monarch, who's one of the last California Grizzlies. So here's his beautiful face, a photo from 1996, so fairly recent. So I'll just start. Monarch was captured in 1889 by Alan Kelly. The summer of 1889, he was commissioned by William Randolph Hearst to find a California grizzly and bring it back alive. Hearst was the editor of the San Francisco Examiner and was developing the nation's largest newspaper chain and media company, Hearst Communications. The impetus to find a California grizzly was because Hearst thought they were almost extinct and thought it would be a huge story for the newspaper if they found the last living example. Alan Kelly, who's pictured on the left, is a newspaper reporter for the Examiner, and he had some hunting experience. So he later writes about his experiences with a variety of different bears in a book called Bears I Have Met and Others that were published in 1903. He spent about 5 months that summer, like from the summer on in 1889, trying to capture a California grizzly, and he was pretty unsuccessful. In late October, he hears of a captured wild bear and decides to purchase it and bring it back to San Francisco. So when Monarch is captured, Kelly says he's about 4 feet high at the shoulders, measures 3 feet across his chest, and his weight is estimated to be about 1,200 to 1,600 pounds. So on the right is a drawing of Monarch from Kelly's book. So even though Kelly purchases the bear, he still has to transport the bear from the San Gabriel Mountains to San Francisco. And it takes about 4 days to get the bear down the mountain. So the illustration on the left, you see like a sled. They would kind of tie him up to the sled and then have horses pull it and then pull him down the mountain. And then each night they would chain him to a tree so that he wouldn't escape. Once down the mountain, Kelly and his team then had to transport Monarch by wagon and then by train. So it probably took about a week or two to get to San Francisco. Monarch and Kelly arrive in San Francisco in November, and he is part of a display at Woodward Gardens. So that's probably him. That's him in captivity on the right. And he is named Monarch after the Examiner slogan, "Monarch of the Dailies." So in 1889, he's put on display at Woodward's Gardens. This was an amusement park at Valencia and 15th Street in San Francisco. If you live in the city, it's kind of hard to imagine this like huge private amusement park in the middle of the Mission, but it did exist. It had a private zoo that included a sea lion pond, grizzly bear grottos, black swans, deers, and an aviary. Monarch was put on display while Hearst tried to figure out how he could have his own space in Golden Gate Park. The photos on the left is the entrance of Woodward Gardens, and the photo on the right is it's a space for performing bears. Just so you know, Monarch never performed. These were different bears. And the Examiner estimated about 20,000 people came to see Monarch when they showed him off in November of 1889. An interesting observation was that people didn't think Monarch was a true grizzly because his fur was all black and not grizzled or gray-tipped. They actually had the curator of mammalogy at the time come and confirm that Monarch was indeed a true grizzly. Sometime in 1892 and 1893, Monarch moves to an enclosure in Golden Gate Park, but shortly afterward, he becomes part of a display at the 1894 Midwinter Fair, which is held in the park. The fair encompasses 200 acres and is centered on Music Concourse, where the Academy is today. There were 120 structures constructed for the exposition, and more than 2 million people visited. And looking at the image on the left, you can see how extensive the fair was. Monarch was part of the 49er mining camp exhibit, where they had food, games, and an interpretation of what life was like for California miners in 1849. They had a stagecoach, which was held up daily by bandits, gambling tables, a dance hall, saloon, and gold panning sluices. And so Monarch, though, unfortunately wasn't very popular as an exhibit, and he was kind of overshadowed by more exotic animals like the flamingos. And the photo on the right is him in a bear pit that was part of the display for the mining camp. So he lives in Golden Gate Park. He has an enclosure. He actually lives out the rest of his life in Golden Gate Park. His enclosure is caged and concrete, and it's referred to as bear pit. And it also allows people to come right up to the cage. So you can see some photos of Monarch looking a little sad. So the bear pits was Monarch's home, and most likely it was situated in the AIDS Memorial Grove in the park, which is actually behind the academy. So Monarch hasn't really traveled that far in the last 100 years or so. And then, and also I wanted to note that he lived through the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, and actually became a figure of strength and rejuvenation when they were starting to rebuild the city. Okay, and then I just like to show some of these photos of Monarch, just because there's not a lot of them of him when he's alive. So I just showed off a few. Only the bison remain today in the park, but there used to be a large variety of animals. There were deer, elk, moose, caribou, and antelope. There were even elephants, zebras, emus, and ostriches. But in the late 1920s, they moved to San Francisco Zoo. So during his time, Monarch would have had a little bit of company. And then in 1903, his keepers noticed that Monarch seems a little lonely and listless. And so they decide to bring in a silver-tipped grizzly from Idaho, who was to be his mate, otherwise known as Mrs. Monarch. They named her Montana, and the illustration on the right is the only image we have of her. It's reported that wasn't a huge fan of Monarch, but they do go on to have a cub in January 1904. But the cub dies shortly afterwards, and then they have a cub again in November of that same year, and then 2 more cubs in January of 1907. And so on the left is an illustration of Monarch's cubs at 3 months. On May 10th, 1911, Monarch is euthanized. He had been suffering from paralysis for a few months, and his condition had gotten worse, and so they decided that it was best to put him to sleep. His 2 cubs were still living in the bear pit at the time, and they continued to live there until the 30s. So he lived in captivity for a total of 22 years. But this isn't the end of Monarch's story. In the fall of 1911, Monarch is mounted and put on display at the Natural History Department of the Memorial Museum, which we now know as the DeYoung. His bones, minus the skull, were buried and then later recovered and donated to the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley. So the image on the left is the Memorial Museum around 1910, and the image on the right is the photo of Monarch from 1952, but in his original mount, which you can see is a little overstuffed. We know that he was on display for a while at the DeYoung, and then he was put into storage before he came to the Academy. So in 1952, Monarch is transferred to the Academy. He's remounted and then put on display. The photo on the left is a picture of Monarch with Dr. Robert Orr, who's the Academy's curator of Ornithology and Mammalogy, somewhere outside in Golden Gate Park in 1953. And the photograph on the right shows Monarch on display inside the Academy with a sign that says Last California Grizzly. And this photo was taken around 1954. And also kind of around the time when he comes in 1952, Monarch also becomes the model for a revised California state flag. The original bear flag had been adopted by the state in 1911, but however, depending on the manufacturer, the bear image, colors, and size would vary. So in 1952, the state legislature wanted to standardize the flag. They commissioned Don Green Kelly, an editor at the Academy, to create the design for the new California state flag. Kelly used Monarch as a model for his drawing, but was asked to keep the pose of Charles Christian Null's drawing from 1854. So you can see Kelly's sketch on the left and then Null's drawing on the right. So you can see Null's drawing kind of makes California Grizzly look wolfish. So it was the sketch is a little bit of an update. And then the new standard flag included specifications for size and color, and included a standard bear image that you can see on the right. And all of these specifications were adopted in 1953. So on the left, you can see Monarch as he was on display in 1990, shown as the model of the flag. Also, I'll point out his fur looks a little reddish brown, and that really is due to being on display for so long. He originally was pretty black. And then the last time Monarch was on display at the Academy was for an exhibit called Altered State, Climate Change in California, which ran from 2008 to 2012. This was one of the exhibits we had when we reopened the museum after major renovations. Altered State used California as a case study to explore the science of climate change and the effects we might see in our own backyard. Monarch was displayed in the case that focused on endangered and extinct organisms. And in this case, there was also a California condor and northern spotted owl, which are still endangered. So you can see the photo on the left shows the case as it was on display. And then the photo on the right shows staff carefully putting Monarch inside the case. After being on display for roughly 100 years, Monarch has been put away for preservation and conservation purposes. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Moe Flannery, our Ornithology and Mammalogy collection manager, who'll give you a peek at the pelt room and also probably a glimpse at Monarch himself.
Everyone, you've now heard the story from Rebekah about Monarch and all the great information that she's provided you. So I thought I would take you to a space here in the Academy that people don't usually get to go to. I'm Moe Flannery. I'm the Senior Collections Manager of Ornithology and Mammalogy. And this room, as you'll see, is pretty small, so we don't ever take tours here. So you're getting a very unique opportunity to see the inside of the room that we call the pelt room. So this is a refrigerated room in order to keep pests out of the room. Pelts are tan skins of animals that include the fur and the claws, but they don't include any other information in any other material. And they need to be kept supple and soft so that they don't dry and harden and crack over time. So the pelt cooler is a great place for us to store our hanging pelts. But we also have several other specimens in here, mounted birds like the condor you can see behind me that are used for display purposes, and also some mounted mammals and one very special resident of this room. But I'm going to show you a little bit of the room here, and you can meet some of the critters that live in this space. So we have a leopard here and a tiger. This tiger was actually confiscated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, illegally imported into the United States. And it came here to be archived since the people who imported it could not keep it, and they were actually prosecuted. So some of the strange mounts that we have here are not necessarily for display purposes, but are for archiving for historical purposes, especially when things like a confiscation happens, an illegal import. There's a golden eagle from before the Eagle Protection Act. And then behind the golden eagle, that is not Monarch, but that is a Kodiak bear. He's very, very tall. He's from Alaska in the 1950s. Sorry, his head is a little bit bright, but you get the idea. And then we'll spin across. You can get a better look at that condor that was behind me. So this condor was on display in the old museum and is currently in storage until it can go on display again. And then really the star of the show, the key resident of this room, is right here. And this is Monarch. I like to think of Monarch as the specimen that ties together a lot of the institutions in the Bay Area, both arts and scientific institutions. So as you heard from Rebekah, he was brought to San Francisco, started the San Francisco Zoo. So there's a link with the San Francisco Zoo. He was trapped by a trapper that was hired by William Randolph Hearst. So that's a link to the Examiner. And then when he died, he was stuffed and became a pelt. And at first, he was on display at the Young Art Museum across the street from the Academy. And then he was donated here. So that's the DeYoung Museum. And then the Academy. So that's four important institutions in the city. And then his bones, except for his skull, we don't know where the skull is, are at UC Berkeley in their scientific research collection. So he ties together, in my mind anyway, all those institutions, and he was especially important in the founding of the San Francisco Zoo, but here in Golden Gate Park, right across from the museum. So you can see from his mount that his nose is missing the hair that it would typically have. That's from the time when he was on display at the DeYoung Museum and people would come up to him and touch him. You might be wondering why he's not on display here right now. And it's primarily because Monarch is a very important scientific specimen and historical specimen. And he needs to be displayed with proper environmental conditions. So he needs temperature control and pest control and lighting control. And in order to do that, we have to build a special case for him in a special place in the museum. And we have not yet identified that special place, nor have we identified the funding to pay for a case. But someday, hopefully, we will get him back on display so that members of the public can enjoy him again because he is so important. And then there's the aspect of the California flag too. I forgot about that. He was important in that. So let's look at his position so you can see. Let me move the computer a little bit. You can kind of see that he is positioned in the 4 feet on the floor pose of the bear and the California flag. Let's just look at him from the side of his head if it's not too dark under here. So he's in that great position. His mount is a little bit overstuffed. I don't think they weren't very conservative when they stuffed him full of material. We did do an X-ray of the mount in search for the skull to see if possibly the skull was included inside of the mounted skin. But unfortunately, it's not. It's just lots of wires and plaster and things like that. So we don't know where Monarch's skull is, actually. He does have all of his nails. You can see them on his feet there. And you can see how his front legs are up a little bit higher than his back legs, like on the California flag. So this is where Monarch stays. And I'll give you one last look at him from the front so you can enjoy him. for this brief moment until he gets on display sometime in the future.
Hi, Mo. Hi, Rebekah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for both of your presentations. We have quite a few questions, so let's see. Let's get started with this one. How old was Monarch when he died?
That is a very good question. I don't think we know because we don't know how old he was when he was captured. So like I said, he was in captivity for 22 years. He was an adult, I'm pretty sure, but other than that, we don't know exactly. Over 22.
And around, I guess kind of to give some framing to it, what is the lifespan of a grizzly bear?
You're going to leave that up to me, Rebekah, right? And
yeah.
I don't know that. I'm not sure.
Maybe we can ask Pete later then.
Yes.
Okay. Other questions. What ended up happening with Monarch's cubs?
Well, I don't know. It's not clear. 2 of them continue living in the bear pit afterwards. And they may just have lived there until they died, but it's not clear. There's not a lot of documentation about what happens to them. And I know the first cub died. I mean, that was in the newspaper. And so, yeah, but like it's pretty scant documentation. So we're not sure.
And
but
we do actually have a pelt of one of his cubs in the pelt room. So instead of being a mounted one, it's a flat pelt that's hanging in the back of the pelt room. But it also has very little data associated with it. People weren't as good about keeping important scientific data like dates and locations with things back then. So one of them is in the academy.
And
do we know what happened to the cub's mom?
No, we don't. Yeah, there's not any information about Montana. I mean, I didn't even know she existed until I did a bit of digging for this talk. So, yeah.
I think this one's for Mo. Why would Monarch's skull go missing? Well, I guess it could be either.
Yeah, it's unclear. I mean, skulls are usually the most valuable part of a scientific specimen because they include the teeth, which can help us in aging some animals. So if we had his teeth, we might be able to cut a canine tooth in half and count the layers. So then we would know specifically how old he was. But because the data, I mean, we're talking about 1911, and then when he went to the De Young for display, when animals are put on display in the past, a lot of the times the data are lost with them. Like, people don't want tags hanging off of specimens with the date and the place where it was found. And so unfortunately the data were unclear. And in fact, if you check different catalogs, the actual location that Kelly collected him from is different for his mount in our catalog and his bones at MVZ. So it's the early data are not as clear. The provenance was not as clear. So who knows what happened to his skull? We have no clear evidence of where it might have gone. But the good thing is the bones are still there, and the bones can be used for different genetic studies. And there have been studies done to try and they're working on sequencing the entire genome of the California grizzly in hopes of the reintroduction of the extinct animals.
Yeah, and Pete will be touching on that right after this. Mo, you kind of talked a little bit about this, but there is a question on, does Monarch have his teeth? And then, yeah, if you could analyze those to get approximate age.
Yep, so we would be able to if we had his skull, but we don't have them.
Yeah. How many claws per foot?
I'm pretty sure it's 5. although I have not ever counted, to be honest with you.
That's fair. Who was caring for Monarch? Was it the city, the paper? Do we know?
It was the city. I mean, it was part of the Parks Commission. So like there's some of the pictures are from the SF Parks Commission. So it was the city because they also took care of other animals in the park. So yeah.
And then we have one last question. How do you preserve tissues like the tip of the snout where it has mucous membranes? Is it not the original tissue?
So it is the original skin with all the original hair on it. So the nose of Monarch is actually his original nose. So when you tan, first you have to skin the animal, and then you have to tan it using chemicals to tan the hide so that it doesn't continue to decompose over time. And so we just skin it very close around the nose and just tan the inside. So it's hard to get genetic information from pelts. That's why the bones are important, because people can get genetic DNA from the bones. But because of the chemicals in the tanning process, you can't get good genetic material from a pelt or from the nose. Although they did, I believe they took some samples from his foot pads on the bottom of his feet because they're very, very thick. So they may have had some formalin injected in them. We don't know for sure. And I should check in with Beth Shapiro down at UC Santa Cruz because they're the team that's working on the grizzly bear genome to see if they were actually able to get DNA from those pads. But it's just the tanning process that, so really Monarch is just a skin over a frame.
And actually one other question came in. Are there any future plans for Monarch to be on display at the Academy?
We would love to put him back on display. However, he does need to be in a special case with special environmental conditions, and they're really expensive. So if you know anyone who wants to give, $75,000 to the Academy to put Monarch on display, we would do it as soon as possible. But we're working on trying to raise the funds to get him what he needs to be properly displayed so that he doesn't fade any further than he already has and doesn't lose more fur or anything like that. We have to take good care of him.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, Moe and Rebekah, for joining us tonight. We're going to pass it on to Pete, who's going to talk more about what drove grizzly bears to extinction and ask the question of if they could be brought back.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you tonight, and special thanks to Christina and Lynn for inviting me. So some of you all, having heard that wonderful presentation by Rebekah and the follow-up by Moe, might be wondering, why do we have all this stuff? Why do we have all of these remnants of animals that are no longer with us? And so the answers are complicated. They're part historical, they're part cultural, they're part scientific. But I think one of the important things to remember is that in the case of the California grizzly, they are all we have left, at least for now. And so what I want to do in the next few minutes here is tell you a little bit about the past, the history of grizzlies in California, and maybe their potential future as well. This is a topic that I've been working on with colleagues down at UC Santa Barbara and elsewhere for about the past 5 years. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work we've done and the work that we're planning to do in the next few. So the first thing to know about grizzly bears, which are also called brown bears worldwide, is that they're one of 8 currently existing species of bears that are still with us. There were other species of bears that lived long ago during the Pleistocene, hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. But brown bears are one of the 8 currently existing bear species, along with Asiatic black bears, some bears, sloth bears, American black bears, spectacled bears, panda bears, and polar bears. Polar bears are the most closely related to grizzlies of any of the other 7 species that currently exist in the world. Of the brown bears that are still out there, distributed around the northern hemisphere, About 15 species or subspecies of brown bears are currently given Latin names and recognized as existing either in the current or in the recent past. And so on the left here on this slide, you have a list of brown bear subspecies, including 3, the ones in red, that are considered extinct. So there are 15 recognized subspecies of brown bears. 3 of them are currently considered extinct. And one of those, number 10, is the California grizzly. It, however, is a member of a larger group that has now been studied genetically and is considered part of clade 4 of 6 clades or genetic lineages of brown bears worldwide. And along with California grizzlies in that clade are other grizzly bears in other parts of North America, including in places like Yellowstone and Glacier National Park, where they currently exist today. So although California grizzlies are no longer with us, they're very, very close relatives in places like Montana and Wyoming and Alberta and British Columbia still are with us. Brown bears are not the most numerous bears currently existing around the world. That honor belongs to American black bears. But they are the most widely distributed still, even though their range has shrunken quite a bit over the last many decades due to persecution by people. Brown bears still exist throughout parts of northwestern North America. They exist in Europe and in Asia and the Middle East. The population estimates worldwide are about 40,000 brown bears in Alaska, about 25,000 throughout Canada, about 2,000 now in the lower 48 US states, which is actually down from the estimate from 1800 of about 50,000 brown bears in the lower 48 US states, but up from a low of less than 1,000 back in the 1970s. So the population has declined by over 95% over the last couple hundred years, but then it's increased by about 50% over about the last 40 years. Anyway, the total population of brown bears worldwide is estimated to be about 200,000 now, or a little bit more. I think one of the most important things to recognize about brown bears is that they are an amazing animal. They are one of the most diverse and flexible and intelligent animals you can find out there in the world. And as a result, they can live in a wide variety of different places, from the alpine tundra to temperate rainforests to Mediterranean-style ecosystems like we have here in California and that also exist in parts of Europe. And even on the top right here, that brown bear is part of a small population that still exists in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia and Central Asia. I like to think of brown bears as the Swiss Army knives of bears, because unlike polar bears, they're close relatives, which are specialized animals that do a couple things really well. Brown bears can do lots of different kinds of things pretty well. And so that makes them flexible, adaptable, and able to thrive in a variety of different environments. This map shows the presumed distribution of brown bears at different times in the past in the American West. The light green shaded areas on this map are where brown bears are believed to have lived about 200 years ago, let's say around 1800 or 1820. The dark green areas are the areas that brown bears' range had shrunk to by about 1900. So about 120 years ago, brown bears were already restricted to much smaller areas than they had been a century earlier. And then the numbers here, which may be a little bit hard to see, but you can get a sense of them, indicate either the last sightings or presumed extinctions of brown bears in particular parts of the American West. I'll talk about more about that in just a second. California has a rich history, a rich documentary history of brown bears, of which Monarch is an enormous part. But there's a lot of other materials out there, documents, specimens, writings about brown bears in California. This image depicts lassoing, roping of brown bears that California ranchers, settlers used to engage in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in California. Here is an image that may be familiar to some of you. This is Grizzly Adams. Grizzly Adams actually had a museum and kind of circus at the corner of Clay and Kearny Streets in downtown San Francisco, where he had an entire menagerie of animals, but his most famous ones were his brown bears, his namesake brown bears. Unfortunately, Grizzly Adams died around the age of 46 or 47, about my age, but he died of a series of injuries that were inflicted on him by the bears in his captivity. And so he might not have been the smartest guy to work with brown bears at that time. Here's an image of Monarch. So by the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the brown bear population in California, which had peaked probably before the gold rush at about 10,000 brown bears. And it's worth saying that prior to the gold rush in California, the population estimate for people was about 110,000. The population estimate for brown bears was about 10,000. That means that in California, just prior to the gold rush, there's about one grizzly for every 11 people. So this is an image of Monarch after he was captured in the late 19th century. This map, again, a little bit hard to see, but I think you get the sense, shows you the last year of the last sighting by county in California of brown bears. And so what you see is that some of the areas where brown bears disappeared first were in the Bay Area, in the Sacramento Valley, places that were among the first areas in California to be settled primarily by Anglo settlers during the mid-19th century, leading up to and then after the gold rush. Brown bears hung on in some other areas quite a bit later, even in Los Angeles County, until the early 20th century. The last credible sighting of a brown bear in California was on the western slope of Sequoia National Park in 1924, almost 100 years ago. This is what we've got today. We've got brown bears, symbols of brown bears everywhere. This is the UCLA Bruin. We find them everywhere, except actually out there on the landscape. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, my group at UC Santa Barbara, the California Grizzly Research Network, formed to take the first look in many years at the past and potential future of brown bears, to try to really look at the materials, to try to understand their history, their ecology, to take a fresh perspective, and then to try to understand if by chance, perchance they could ever come back, if we could bring them back. And so that's what we've been working on for the past several years out of UC Santa Barbara, and also with a range of colleagues and collaborators at institutions around the state, from other University of California campuses to the La Brea tar pits, to folks in Montana and Oregon, and even over in Europe as well. So you may ask, why now? Why are we doing this right now? Why did this come up at this time? Well, there are a bunch of reasons, and I'll just list off some of them very quickly. The first reason we chose to study grizzly bears now in California, even though they've been gone for almost a century, is that grizzlies are actually recovering in some other places like the Northern Rockies around Yellowstone. Their populations have increased significantly in those areas to the point where there's a debate about whether they should be removed from the Endangered Species Act in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and also in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem around Glacier National Park. Another thing is that the black bear population in California is doing great. There are about 4 times as many black bears in California as there were in the 1980s. The population has risen from around 10,000 in the 1980s to as many as 40,000 now, which suggests that bears can do well in California under the right circumstances. As many of you probably know, wolves returned to California for the first time in 80 years in 2011. And we now have a small population, a pack or two of wolves in Northern California, around Mount Shasta in that area. So the return of large carnivores to the state, potentially, over time. In 2014, a nonprofit organization submitted a petition to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife to consider whether or not to bring grizzlies back to California in the Southwest. Those agencies didn't pick up the ball and run with it. In part as a result, we did at UC Santa Barbara. And so we're sort of filling in that gap a little bit. In Europe, large carnivores have recovered and are actually doing pretty well. The 4 large carnivores native to Europe, lynx, wolves, wolverines, and brown bears, are all actually doing okay right now. And as a matter of fact, there are more than 10 times as many brown bears in Europe currently as there are in the lower 48 US states. That suggests that brown bears can live in places even where there are people sharing the landscape. In Washington State, in the North Cascades, there's a grizzly bear recovery plan to hopefully bring grizzlies back to the North Cascades. And then in California, there's a possibility, or signs at least, that some people in the state might be showing a growing tolerance of large carnivores in certain areas of California. And this is evidenced by a bunch of different cases, but one of the most famous is the case of P22, who is the Griffith Park mountain lion who currently lives in Griffith Park in the center of Los Angeles and has been doing so since about 2011. So these are all reasons to think that maybe it's time, for the first time in a long time, to take a fresh look at grizzly bears in California. So what has our group learned? I'll just give you a few bullet points on what we've learned. We still have a lot to learn, but here's what we found out so far. First of all, grizzlies are surprisingly new to California. Brown bears have been in California for probably at least 1 million years and maybe quite a bit longer. Black bears, sorry, have been in California for at least 1 million years and quite a bit longer. Grizzlies are really new to California. As a matter of fact, in some parts of the state, the oldest grizzly fossils that we have are only about 7,000 years old. This suggests that grizzlies showed up here really late and that they may have showed up in some parts of California around the same time or even later than people. That's a really fascinating fact about their evolution and their ecological history. Second, before 1769, which is the beginning of the Mission era in California, grizzlies lived almost everywhere around the state except in its deserts. So California had great grizzly habitat in a variety of different areas except in its hot deserts. Third, in California, grizzlies subsisted on a range of foods. I would tell you all about that because it's absolutely fascinating, but I think Alexis is going to do some of that. She's up next, and so I'm going to leave that to her. Fourth, we found out through our study of the historical record that habitat loss didn't kill off California's grizzlies. It wasn't the loss of their habitats, it was persecution, really by a small group of people, really by a small group of white men with guns, traps, and poisons who killed off California's grizzlies. Grizzlies can live almost anywhere in almost any temperate or subarctic climate or region where people will allow them. And so this suggests that living with grizzlies is really about human tolerance more than something about the physical or biological habitat, because they are such flexible and diverse species. California still today, believe it or not, contains plenty of potential habitat in which grizzlies could be introduced. In the Sierra Nevada, in the Los Padres National Forest, in the Northwest Forest, we still have a lot of it. Reintroducing grizzlies to these areas would be really tough. There would be a lot of things to sort out. It would take a long time and it would take an investment by a lot of people. But it could happen if the people of this state demanded it. There's no biological reason why it couldn't, which means that the question is really one of politics and law and management. It's also much easier, we've learned, to answer questions like where, when, and how grizzlies should be reintroduced to California than it is to explain or answer the question of why. The question of why has a lot to do with ideas like belonging. They're not biological in any way, but really are important when we start to think about what we're really doing by talking about reintroduction and what the values and attitudes and beliefs and morals and ethics are that underlie those debates, those discussions, and those kinds of questions. And then finally, I just want to say that one of the most important things I've learned studying this over the last many years is that studying grizzlies in California is only partly about bears. What it's also about is two other things. It's about coexistence of people with wildlife. How can we achieve coexistence? How can we work toward that? What does it look like? What does it mean? But also coexistence of people with people. If people could agree to do something like make space in this state of 40 million people for grizzly bears, then what else that seems really hard could we actually achieve? So coexistence. The second thing is imagination. One of the biggest impediments to thinking about doing something like bringing grizzly bears back to a state like California is that for many people, it seems almost impossible to imagine. To study grizzlies in this state and to even contemplate bringing them back is to engage in an exercise of imagination, and a very particular exercise of imagination in which the goal is to imagine a better future than the one that for many young people seems like it's in front of them. A cleaner, greener future with more coexistence and with more wildlife, not less. So I want to leave you now with a fun video. So this is from the BBC. It's from a trail cam in the Canadian Rockies. And it shows a behavior that's kind of fun to watch and goofy to watch, but it's really important. So it turns out that brown bears in their native habitats, they do a lot of different kinds of behaviors. One of the things they do is they scratch and they rub on trees. This is a way of marking their territory, and this achieves a bunch of different goals and purposes. One of the things, oh my gosh, that's so cute. One of the things it does is it marks trees to let other bears know where other bears are, right? It's a means of communication. It's a means of marking out a territory that contains certain kinds of resources. It's a means of attracting other bears, and it's also a means of repelling them so that bears can actually share habitats without having to always encounter one another, which can be a harrowing and dangerous situation for them. And so this goofy kind of activity that these bears are doing, you know, rubbing up against trees like this, it looks like they're dancing a little bit. This is actually a really important behavior that enables them to communicate with one another. And I don't know, it's fun to watch, but I think we can also probably learn a lot from them. Thank you so much.
Hi, Pete. Thank you so much. We're going to let this video play because people would be very upset if we
I could watch this on a loop all day. Just all day.
Yeah. But we do have a ton. Oops, one of my headphones just fell out. We do have a lot of questions. So let's get started. But one of the first ones is, what is the fallout from the loss of this apex predator in California?
That's a great question, and it's so hard to answer. And the reason it's hard to answer is because although we have really valuable historical records like specimens that we saw before of Monarch and other bears, what we don't have is really good ecological data from before from before and after. From before and after, should I play it again?
Sure.
From before and after the disappearance of brown bears in California. And so that's what you'd want to do. You'd want to have data before and after. And so we don't know, but what we can say is that brown bears, unlike wolves, which are, you know, pretty much obligate carnivores, they eat mostly meat, they pursue their prey, they hunt in packs, they have a particular set of consequences of being on the landscape that we can study pretty easily. Brown bears are different because they consume a wide variety of different kinds of resources. And so it's not like they're having a single impact on a single prey species. You know, mountain lions eat mostly deer in California. And so the impact of mountain lions is going to be largely on deer populations, and then the impact of deer populations on the ecosystem. With regard to bears, they're eating berries, they're eating fish, they're scavenging, they're maybe doing a little bit of preying on things, but they're actually not that good at being predators. So you know, maybe a little bit of that. And so it really depends on the system. And so it's very context dependent for omnivores like brown bears as opposed to real carnivores like mountain lions. I think what we can say is that in a state with 10,000 grizzly bears prior to the gold rush, there would have been significant impacts on everything from the behavior of prey species to the abundance and behavior of smaller carnivores and omnivores, to the populations of migratory fish like salmon, to interactions with people, with indigenous people who they live with in this state for thousands of years. And so the best way to understand some of those things is actually to look at other areas of the world where bears have been removed and then brought back. And those are the kinds of experiments that we're trying to use to understand what could possibly happen if we did bring grizzlies back to California. It turns out to be a really hard question to answer.
Yeah. And people have a lot of questions about just kind of like the specifics of that. So here's a question. So are we talking about bringing a bear population from another area and allowing it to populate? Or could we possibly use DNA from an extinct California grizzly bear and create a sort of new bear?
Okay, first of all, we're not talking about anything yet. So our group, one of our basic premises is that we're gathering the information and we're trying to understand this issue without advocating for a particular management option yet. But we can answer that question, I think. So if you go back to one of the earlier slides that I showed, where it showed the 15 subspecies of brown bears worldwide, and then the evolutionary lineages, those really didn't match up. And that's a historical thing. The subspecies were named before we had the tools to understand the genetic relatedness of different populations. So it turns out that the subspecies don't match up very well with what we now know about the evolutionary lineages. So that's kind of an issue. But if you look at the evolutionary lineages, clade 4, California grizzlies were part of clade 4. What does clade 4 also include? It includes bears in places like Yellowstone and Glacier National Park and Alberta and British Columbia. And so those populations in some areas are doing well and are actually increasing in places like Yellowstone. And, it's kind of a crass way to put it, but in Yellowstone, we're getting pretty close to having a surplus of bears. Yellowstone National Park is now pretty much at carrying capacity for brown bears after a significant recovery there. And so the result is that brown bears are now spreading out to the countryside, including, dozens of miles onto the Great Plains in Montana and Wyoming, in places they haven't been seen for a long time. And so that's causing some adjustment of people there and some potential conflicts. And so I think that, with a growing population in a place like Yellowstone of bears that we know are clearly genetically related to the bears that lived in California, there's a potential pathway for that in the future based on the previous success of brown bear conservation in other parts of the lower 48 U.S. states.
Interesting. So someone just brought up something interesting, but about how with global warming and the changing climate in California, how does that factor into your group's work on whether or not this is possible and a good thing?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. That's a great question. So I think that the answer to this is going to be counterintuitive for some folks. And it's debatable. I'm going to give you my view on this, but it's certainly debatable. So brown bears live in a huge range of environments, including there was a significant historical population of brown bears in northern Mexico, parts of which are considerably warmer and drier than California. If we look at where brown bears lived in California historically, there were lots of them in Southern California. As we see more Southern California-like conditions move further north, I think that there's no reason to expect that in any time in the near future, brown bears would be in a situation where there was no more suitable habitat left in California that they could feasibly live in. But there's another issue there. And so I want to suggest actually that one of the best things we can do to address the challenges of climate change is to reassemble our ecosystems, to make sure that the whole suite of native species are there, that they're being managed properly, that they have healthy populations, and that they're fulfilling their historic ecological roles, right? And if we do that, then what we do is we add layers of resilience onto ecosystems that in some cases have been degraded, and that in various ways, through promoting those historic ecological processes, right, through that active restoration, we're actually going to be in way better shape in the future to address the challenges of climate change than we would be otherwise. I don't think climate change should prevent us from trying to heal environmental damage.
Great, thank you for that. And then I have a final question. What do you think is stopping grizzlies just from migrating back into the state?
Yeah, sure. So there's Oregon, there's Nevada, there's places in between where grizzlies currently live and where we are now. I think the thing to realize is that animals have very different abilities to disperse, to move to new areas. And so with wolves are very mobile. They move around a lot. They can move dozens of miles a day in some cases. And so they disperse very easily in search of prey. And that's because they're a prey pursuing species, right? A carnivore that pursues large prey largely. Brown bears are very different. They don't move nearly as much. And as a matter of fact, it was long thought that by researchers working in the lower 48 US states, that brown bears were pretty stationary. Turns out that they're only stationary in places like Yellowstone until you fill the landscape up with brown bears, and then they start to move, and a lot of them get out, right? Yeah. It was also actually, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but it was also actually believed that the ones that moved were mostly young males looking for new territory. That's kind of true, but now we also know from Montana that if you live in an area packed full of bears, including a lot of male bears, and you're a sow, a female bear with cubs, you have a strong incentive to find someplace safe. Right? Because encounters of sows with cubs and males can be very dangerous. And so we're learning more about brown bear mobility. and habitat use in that way. But I think it's safe to say that although wolves can travel great distances, brown bears are much more limited. And it's very unlikely because of that, given the distance between even extreme northeastern California and the closest brown bear population remaining today, that they would be able to traverse that distance in any kind of foreseeable future. So they would need our help.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Pete. This is really fascinating. We'll also drop a link to the California Grizzly Research Network in the comments because people are asking about where they could learn more about your work. So
please do. Thank you.
Yeah. And okay, everyone, we're gonna head back into the collections with Moe, and she's gonna show you some grizzly skulls. Okay, see you in a bit.
Hi again, everyone. Moe Flannery here, but now I'm in a different collection room. So I am in our main collection room, which is in a different part of the Academy. And this room is not as cold as the pelt room from earlier. Pelt room is usually about 50 degrees. This room is at 65 degrees. It's a much bigger room. And in this room, we house our bird specimens, over 100,000 bird specimens, 32,000 mammal specimens, and 11,000 eggs and nests. So bird study skins, bird skeletons, eggs and nests, mammal study skins, mammal skeletons, and big mammal bones are all in this big room that you can't really see, but you can see some of the cabinets behind me. But there is one special case in this room, also a case that is not shown to people very often. This is our extinct and endangered specimen case. So we don't have a lot of specimens from extinct mammals or birds. So there's more endangered and threatened specimens and type specimens in this case. So a type specimen is the original specimen that was identified, the first specimen that was used to name a species. So everything after that is supposed to look like the type specimen. And that's how you determine a species. So there's some type specimens in here. There's some endangered species. There's some extinct animals. And of course, the extinct animal that we're most interested in today is the California grizzly. And right here next to me is a California grizzly skull. So this one looks like it was shellacked at some point. Usually we don't put any kind of treatment on the bones, but this one was shellacked at some point. And I'll give you a little bit of a closer look. This one, we don't know when it was found. Let me get the camera on him. Sorry about that. I just changed the lights dramatically there. So we don't know when it was found, but it was collected from Monterey County, from Marina. It has a pretty early number, 5567, which indicates to me, you can see the catalog number written on the jaw there, that this specimen came to us from the Stanford collection. So as some of you may know, the Academy, during the 1906 earthquakes, the fires came through and destroyed everything that we had in the museum at that time. But in subsequent years, we rebuilt the collection with specimens from other places. And Stanford in the 1960s or 70s decided that they were going to donate their bird and mammal collection to us. So this almost fully intact, it's missing a few teeth, California grizzly skull is the best representative of the species that we have in the collection. And it came to us from Stanford. So this specimen, along with the other bone specimens in this case, have actually been used in several scientific studies. One of the studies took the tiny bones in the nose. You can barely see some bones on this side of the nose. This one has a lot of the nasal turbinates already ripped out, but usually they're much more full and they take up the entire cavity of the nose. And we have those in our nose too. They're used to clean air as it goes in and out. They're covered with membranes and hairs. But here on the California grizzly, on a specimen like this, if a researcher takes a tiny piece of the bone, they can actually do some studies with that. So in 2013, there was a researcher who took a piece of bone and was looking at stable isotopes to tell us where the specimen was eating and where it was living at the time. So she looked at stable isotopes, and I believe she also radiocarbon dated some of the specimens. So I should look and see if we have a date on this one, but I don't know it right now. So she published that paper, and then a few years later, another researcher was doing a study looking at what coyotes eat today, if they eat marine mammals or more than they did historically, because grizzly bears were here eating marine mammals. So she used the same radioisotope analysis from the original paper. So one tiny little piece of bone, special laboratories, special permission, and you're able to learn so much from that specimen. So she also was able to use the data, use bone samples from some of these other specimens. So this one right here is just a partial cranium from a grizzly bear, right? It's kind of broken up. It's not complete. It's missing parts of it. But this one is it's a record of an animal in a different place at a different time, which is what makes it important. And this one is from Santa Clara County, an Indian mound, and it was dug out of the Indian mound and in 1948, and then was donated here. So this is an even more historical specimen. And then in the back here, this one is another partial California grizzly bear skull. You can see its teeth are all broken off. There's not much other material there. It's let's see if it has its nasal turbinates. Can you see in there? It sort of does. They're way down deep inside. But this is an important specimen because it's from 1909, right? So we know where it came from and when. It was from the Cuyama Plains in Santa Monica, California. The skull actually says 1906, but the label that I read said, this label says 1906 too. And this label says 1909. So there's a little bit of discrepancy there. 1909 might have been when we received it from them. So bones from this skull were also used in that stable isotope analysis. And then last, what I think incredibly interesting too, is another California grizzly skull. This one has teeth, and teeth in mammals can be really useful, actually, in aging the animal. So if we wanted to allow someone to do this, and I'm not sure that we really would have to be really important, they can take that canine tooth, the big tooth on the end there, and you can cut it in half, and then there are layers of dentin and cementum inside the teeth. And if you count those layers, you can learn what the grizzly bear was eating at the time. And I'm sorry, if you count the layers, you can learn how old they are. If you do stable isotope analysis on the layers, you can learn what they were eating at the time. Now, this specimen is a historic specimen, right? It's a California grizzly, and you probably are not going to be able to see that, so I'll keep it on the specimen so you can see it. It came from San Francisco, the city, came from Broderick Street. It was found and excavated from under a building on Broderick Street, and it was excavated in 1999. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if this is the situation with this one, but it probably is. We have several specimens in the collection that have come from houses. One last look at the skull before I tell you the specimen story. Go back around this side. California grizzly skulls are a lot smaller than other grizzlies. Okay. So we have several specimens here in the collection that have been excavated from under houses in San Francisco. So sometimes when people do a rebuild, they'll destroy the house that's there and they find an entire other house or a whole kitchen or something under the ground. And generally those are from 1905 and 1906, pre-1905 and 1906. So when the earthquake happened, it seems like the city just kind of built up above those houses. And I assume that that's where this grizzly bear skull came, or the mandible that I showed you came from, it was excavated from under a house. I guess it could have been buried in someone's yard and then the house was built over it. But all of this material is here, archived in the collection for any researchers who want to study it in the future. And it's very important, especially with these extinct specimens. So thank you very much.
Hi again, Mo.
Hey there.
Thanks for taking us through the collections. We have time for a few questions. The first one, you talked briefly earlier about the conditions we needed for Monarch's pelt. So this one's kind of a follow-up. What kind of conditions do you need in collections to preserve these skulls?
Right. So the specimens in the collections are kept at a specific temperature. Like I said, it was 65 degrees in the room. So we want to keep it cool, but not too cool and not too hot. And we try to keep the relative humidity at about 50%. So that temperature and relative humidity will protect the specimens. We also keep them in closed, gasketed cases, because one of the big problems that can happen in museums are pests that can get into a case and destroy specimens, and especially fur and feathers. Bones are a little more resilient. They can handle conditions that are less than ideal, but we do, for something, especially an extinct animal like that, we want to keep it in the best conditions we can. And lighting too, we always turn the lights off when we're not in the room. They're in the cases to protect them from light as well.
Yeah, and are there any chemicals that are used to preserve the bones?
We don't use chemicals to preserve the bones anymore. They have been used historically during different periods of time. Former museum folks use things like arsenic and mercury. So that's why I wear gloves when I work in the collection room, to protect myself and also to protect the specimens that I'm handling. But we do have to be careful about, we never eat in there or drink in there or put our fingers in, all the hygiene that we're also good at now with COVID. We take precautions against the chemicals that were historically used. We don't use any chemicals today, primarily because they are so dangerous for humans. So we just prepare a skull by a modern skull. We would take the animal, remove the fur and the muscle, and then put it in a bucket of water generally. And the bacteria in the water just degrades the muscle, degrades the brains, and then you come out with a clean skull. Usually the teeth have fallen out, but in most cases they fit back in a lock and key mechanism, so they're really easy to get back in if you know what you're doing. And then we just dry the skulls and usually put them in boxes, but in that case they're not in boxes, and then store them in the collection room that way. So it's archival storage without the use of chemicals.
Interesting. So the first skull that you showed was shellacked, I believe. Does that affect testing and results?
I don't think it does, because Alexis, who is talking next, also sampled a lot of those skulls, and she was able to get stable isotope and radiocarbon information from those skulls. So luckily, the shellac did not damage that. I'm not sure if anyone's done DNA, whether it might denature the DNA a little bit. I don't think anyone has done the genetics on that skull specifically, but hopefully it wouldn't have been damaged.
Do you think there are still a lot more California grizzly skulls in San Francisco waiting to be excavated?
Oh, who knows what could be under some of the houses in San Francisco. I mean, it's really just, those are amazing stories when someone calls you and says they found a mummified cat in an old building under their house. It's very cool. So if you're doing any construction in San Francisco, keep your eye out when you're digging. People do find bones in their backyard, but most often they turn out to be cow bones, which is way better than, finding some other bones in your yard that you don't want to have.
Yeah. This is an interesting one that came in. Do you use beetles to clean bones?
We do. We do use dermestid beetles. We have a dermestid beetle colony. We use them for things like small birds and small mammal skulls, and bird eye rings. We don't generally use them on a large skull like that because water works just as quickly and the beetles are kind of high maintenance. So they do the work on the tiny, tiny specimens that we don't want to lose any of the bones in the maceration process. They're also really good for things like cetacean skulls where the teeth are all exactly the same. They're called monodonts. Every tooth looks exactly the same. They all go everywhere. So we use the dermestid beetles to clean those skulls so that the teeth stay in place. So they're good little workers, the beetles, but we don't use them for everything.
Good to know. A couple more questions. How many bear skulls do we have in the collection and where do they come from?
I would have to query the collection, the database, and you can actually do that yourself if you want, whoever asked that question, because our database is available online through the Cal Academy website on the research pages. So that would be interesting. You could query our database, but even better than querying our database, there are some joint databases that are available. One is called VertNet, VERTNET.org. And that's a collection of over 100 different museum collections, all aggregated together. So you could search VertNet for all the California grizzly skulls in any museum collection. They might show up in the Smithsonian, who knows where they'll show up. And you can see how many grizzly bear skulls there are everywhere. I bet if you were looking for Ursus arctos middendorfi or arctos, the subspecies that are found in Alaska, you'd find tons of specimens, especially up in Alaska. But yeah, those databases are really interesting to look at and to search.
Cool. And I think Christina just threw the link in the chat. So if you're interested, feel free to click that link. And then Mo, last question, who do you call if you do find something in your yard?
You can call us at the Academy. I suggest taking pictures and sending them to us. You can just email me, or if you email through our info, if you can't remember my name, they'll send it on to me. But yeah, you can always get in contact with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Mo. Next up, we have Alexis, who is going to talk more about just how big grizzlies actually were.
Hello, everyone. Excellent. Everyone can see my presentation. So thank you all for bearing with me and waiting to see my presentation. My name is Alexis, and I'm an assistant professor at Middlebury College and a research associate at the La Brea Tar Pits in Los Angeles. And so tonight I'll share some research with you on just how big the California grizzly was and how do we know. So I just want to step back and set the scene for you and think about, why does it matter how large an animal is? So I am from the East Coast, and I was out hiking Big Sur with my best friend, who is also from the East Coast. And we kept hiking around, and we kept coming upon these beautiful vistas and thinking, oh, these are super nice. And finally, when we went to the gift shop, we realized that the whole time we were supposed to be looking for California condors, that's kind of what everything was leading to, that you're supposed to go there to look for California's megafauna. And we felt pretty dumb. And then once we realized that, she was like, oh my God, does that mean that there are also mountain lions where we've been hiking this entire time? And for the rest of the day while we were hiking, the landscape felt very different. We were, unlikely to see either of these two very large animals, but it kind of changed how we felt in this place. Nothing around us had changed, but just knowing that there were large animals around us made us think differently about where we were going to walk and how loud we were going to be. And so it's important to think about how big animals were and how people perceived them, because it really does change how we move around the world and how we coexist with them. And so big animals bring both fear and awe. And that might be why so many of them have recently disappeared, and why today it's always the bigger animals that are more in danger of going extinct. So if we look through time at all of the animals that have gone extinct, all of the mammals since the Pleistocene, we see that it's always these bigger animals. So things like giant ground sloths. In the Anthropocene, it's bigger species going extinct. And all the way into the present day, we've really kept losing all of the big animals. And one of my favorite interactions about this is when I was working at the tar pits. I'd stand there and talk to people about something like a short-faced bear, and they'd be like so amazed, but I'd tell them how big they were, and they'd be like, oh, I'm so glad those are not around today, right? So we have a mixed relationship with these large animals. And we're also so intrigued at the idea of bringing them back. It's this tension of being terrified, but also being in awe. And so we have all these conversations about de-extinction, about releasing large predators, like we just talked about, because we have these complicated relationships with these animals. And I'll argue that looking to the past can provide baselines to help us calibrate what exactly constitutes a large animal for California, right? The present day is not the best picture of what all of California's ecosystems were like. So I'll put in a plug here for a place like the La Brea Tar Pits, where we actually have a record of how large exactly California's mammals used to be and how they've really been downsized over time. We used to have things like saber-toothed cats, and now we have mountain lions. We used to have dire wolves, now we have coyotes. We've been losing all of these big things around us. And when we look at the past, we can start to reframe how we look at these landscapes, right? Similar to how I felt once I realized in Big Sur there might be something stalking me. In Los Angeles, people who feel that coyotes are these new arrivals, when you tell them that there's actually fossils going back thousands of years of coyotes living in the area, it changes things a little bit. It changes how we think about the species that we're sharing the landscape with. And so what about grizzlies? What does the past of grizzlies in California tell us about what a world with grizzlies in California again might look like? What does the past have to add to the story? So when I look up a lot of websites on reintroducing bears in California, I frequently see this number of 2,000 pounds. Here's my favorite infographic, the return of this 2,000-pound beast, blessing or curse. And people seem to throw this number around. And it seems to be very viscerally upsetting. The idea of a 2,000-pound animal. That seems pretty terrifying to me, to be totally honest. But where does this number come from? And where does this perception come from? Because California grizzlies aren't on the landscape today. We're not interacting with them and forming opinions about them based on actual California grizzlies. That information is coming from somewhere else. And so one place that that's really come from is different archives of the past, so narratives and quotes like grizzlies violently attacking people in their kitchen tents, minding their own business, notes taken down during the gold rush, and also even these historic art images showing grizzlies as these terrifying, ginormous animals. But as someone who works in paleontology and biology, and someone who's held a lot of these skulls, I also know that there's another side to this story, and that museum collections not only provide us with the science to answer questions like what did grizzlies eat, or even to look for their DNA, but they also give us an opportunity to retell some of these stories from a different perspective. And so yes, data from these specimens can help us select the right reintroduction places if that is what we want to do, or think about how abundant they used to be. But these collections are also independent data sets that help us test narratives of loss, and also think about, well, this person said this bear was 2,000 pounds. This bear's skull doesn't feel like it belonged to a 2,000-pound animal. What is this disconnect between perception and reality? So where exactly does that 2,000 come from? So I have had the privilege of working with historians like Pete and learning that data comes from many places aside from animal bones. And one of those places are actually old newspaper articles. And so when you go through all of these old newspaper articles about California grizzly bears, you see these numbers about how large they were when they were killed. So you can actually go through and take notes and put in a spreadsheet. This bear was, 1,988 pounds. This bear was about 1,500 pounds. It was all 2 strong horses could do to drag it, right? These are numbers that we can actually test. And just for comparison, many North American grizzlies are less than 1,000 pounds. So this 2,000 number really sticks out like a sore thumb. And what I really wanted to know, as someone whose parent does a lot of fishing and I feel probably exaggerates how big the fish are, right? Was this number real, or was this a case of grandpa's big fish story, right? Were people just reporting that the bears were so giant because they wanted to sound cool, or they got more money for bringing in a larger bear? So again, it's difficult to decide how big a California grizzly should have been based on living bears, because all bears are different. Brown bears range in size depending on where they are and what they're eating. And so some of the bears that live in like a barren ground habitat, like Gobi Desert bears, are around the smallest size. Whereas bears that have access to a lot of marine resources like salmon, like the bears living in Kamchatka, those are really big bears, up to 1,500 pounds. So where would a California grizzly fit in? Well, the Mexican grizzly, unfortunately, is extinct, but that presumably would have been a smaller bear because it's in that type of barren ground habitat. An American grizzly is definitely not 2,000 pounds. And even a Kodiak grizzly living in Alaska eating tons of fish was still less than 2,000 pounds. And so we don't know with California grizzlies how they fit in, especially genetically, with these other bears. But my guess would be that California grizzlies, right, they were eating some combination of a diet like an American grizzly and maybe some combination of a diet like a Kodiak grizzly. And I just want to point out that the usual methods don't apply here, right? We can't just take a California grizzly, put it on a scale. So instead, we had to be really creative in how we approach this question. Because really all that we have left are these little bits and pieces. We don't have the whole bear. We don't even have the whole skeleton. As you heard, Monarch's skull is missing and no one knows where it is. So we can't even weigh a whole skeleton. So we just have these bits and pieces. However, as someone trained as a paleontologist, this is actually normally what we would deal with. We only have bits and pieces of things like dinosaurs. And so there's a whole body of literature focused on reconstructing the body sizes of extinct animals. And so we can take values from the extinct species and compare them to values from living species and actually trace them on an equation. So we have these handy dandy equations that we can use to scale from a tooth or an isolated bone up to what a body size would have been. And so my colleagues and I, working with the California Grizzly Research Network, actually collected all the bear samples in existence for California grizzlies, which you all were talking about in the question and answer session. These are all of them. There's about 60 of them. I went to museums all across the country, and I went around and took samples for isotopes and radiocarbon dates, as well as measured these animals. And so we have samples from pre-European contexts like middens, as well as those from Rancho La Brea, which would have been preserved in naturally occurring asphalt. And then we had historic specimens like those in mammalogy collections and taken as trophies from all across the state as well. So then what we did is I measured the teeth because teeth for mammals are like gold when it comes to paleontologists. We love teeth. That's what preserves really well because they're hard. And also they scale really well with body size. So I took measurements of teeth, and I also took measurements of the skull where available. And I didn't really have long bones for these animals because most of them were trophies where people would only keep the skull. So then I took these measurements and plugged them into our equations. And when we look at this graph here, we see that based on morphology on those measurements, your average California grizzly was maybe 450 pounds. And so this is probably a lower range estimate with these scaling equations errors, but that's still nothing compared to the average estimate from newspaper articles of about 900 pounds, with many ranging up again into that 2000. So it's clear that something's going on. There's a disconnect here. And what's also really cool is that the paleontological estimates, when we know when there's a female and male grizzly bear, if that was recorded at death, we actually see the same body size difference using these equations as you would for a modern population of bears. So basically, California grizzlies were just regular sized grizzly bears from North America. They were not 2,000 pounds. And because we're focused on Monarch tonight, I wanted to tell a story about him in particular. And so the difference between perception and reality for these animals is really embodied in him. As we heard, he was caught near Los Angeles and died after many, many years living in captivity. And from these morphological or paleontological approaches, he should have weighed maybe about 500 pounds or more. But at death, his carcass was recorded at weighing about 1,200 pounds. I've had the very incredible privilege of being able to hold his bones over at the museum in Berkeley. And when you hold them, you can really feel just how gnarled they are. This animal clearly was not having a good life in captivity, was not having a lot of exercise, would probably have packed on the pounds and not been able to really been a very active animal. And then on top of that, we heard a little bit about this term isotopes. As part of a larger study for the California Grizzly Research Network, I studied Monarch's isotopes, actually going and taking hairs from under his armpits at Cal Academy. And so using this technique, we're able to look at whether an animal is eating more or less meat to really simplify it. So on this plot here, animals down here are eating a lot of veggies, animals up here are eating a lot of meat. And so when we look at the wild California grizzlies from near Los Angeles, they're down here on this plot, both their hair and bone, they're eating a lot of veggies. But when we look at Monarch, he is off the charts. He is way up there in the meat category. And so clearly when he was in captivity, he was being fed a lot of meat, probably, and probably not exercising a lot. And so he would have been very obese at death, making that value of his time at death different than what we'd expect from the morphological estimates. And so what I take away from this is that stories about bears and large carnivores in general are not always accurate. And perhaps you shouldn't trust someone named Grizzly Adams to give you an accurate estimate of exactly how big a grizzly bear was. And I think this is important because a negative perception of carnivores, not only is it extremely upsetting to lose a species, but when we lose these carnivores, we lose particular ecological functions. And so we know from research that when we take away a carnivore, it actually changes what the landscape looks like. And so by losing these animals because of a perception, it does actually change our world. And stories about these animals are not always accurate. As I said, even John Muir got it wrong when he said probably 500 or 600 animals had been killed within the bounds of the park in Yosemite, but they're not in danger of extinction. Unfortunately, he got it wrong. They went extinct just a few years later. And another great story that I'll end with is, did 184 grizzlies emerge from a single whale near San Luis Obispo? This was a story told by the champion liar from the area in the 1860s. So there are all these stories that I think present a really rich record for us to address using scientific tools. And that's only possible through collaborations. And it's only possible by looking to the past as we start to think about the future of this species. So with that, I am deeply indebted to all of the museums who let me come in and take samples, including Cal Academy. And I would love to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Man, the story, like just seeing how much meat like that monarch was probably fed, and that difference in wild bears, like I think backstage the nightlife team were just like, oh my gosh, like it's just like kind of horrific. But anyway, so yeah, we have some questions. So can you, first of all, you did mention isotopes a lot, but can you explain what exactly they are and how you get them from like Monarch's armpit?
Yeah, sure. So it goes by the general idea of you are what you eat. So imagine if I took a strand of your hair, I could actually tell you if I sectioned it through time, what you were eating different months ago. So everyone eating their pandemic junk food diets, right? That would show up. And that's because in nature, certain chemical elements like carbon and nitrogen come in different flavors effectively. So some are heavier, some are lighter. And our bodies take those up, and based on those ratios of heavy to light, we can actually get a sense of how much meat an animal is eating. I could go in much further detail, but I don't know if anyone wants that. But the general idea is you are what you eat. And so we can get the proteins from your hair or your bones and actually take a look at these chemical ratios that can tell us how much an animal's eating, or even if it's eating a lot of things like fish, because foods from a marine setting look different than foods from a terrestrial setting.
That's so interesting. Somebody just asked, do the isotopes tell you what the home ranges were? So is there any like sort of geographic data that can be determined?
Yeah, so that one is a little even more intense of an explanation, but those are,
Okay.
We have some different isotopes. So some chemicals are really great for telling you about diet. Others can actually tell you about the home range by thinking about what the local bedrock geology was like. So an isotope known as a chemical known as strontium. If you look at oxygen isotopes that are taken up in the teeth, you can actually look at what local water sources the different animals might be using.
Great. And then how would the newspapers and like other reports, like how would they have even said that they measured the bear? Because like you say, you can't just like put a bear on a scale. Like where do you think these numbers came from?
I think some of them are guesses.
Yeah.
I think some of them they did weigh, because if they had the newspapers, they would have been able to weigh the carcass at death and have an estimate that way.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, it's mostly that I can't weigh them because I only have like bits and pieces. You guys saw, firsthand in the questions what we're left with. But at time of death, perhaps they could weigh them. But I think a lot of them were guesstimates, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it was also really striking when you mentioned that Monarch's bones felt kind of gnarled. I think you used that word. How does that compare to handling like wild grizzly bear bones? Like what do those feel like?
Well, I mean, I guess they feel like normal bones in the sense that they're solid. They're not like nibbled at the edge. They don't look really deteriorated at the edge. So Monarch's bones felt very light. And that's actually probably because he was macerated after death. So he kind of like sat there in some water, his bones. So yeah, he faced a lot of indignities in life and death. But if you see an animal with arthritis, you can see it in their bones. It almost looks like it's like kind of pockmarked on the bones. They're very rough around the edges. So
yeah. People love DNA questions, but so I'll ask: has there been any California grizzly DNA extracted from remains that still exists somewhere?
So I know Beth Shapiro's lab at UC Santa Cruz has really been leading that work and attempts to do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And typically you can get DNA out of pelts, but also bones. It depends often on luck, sometimes luck of preservation. The teeth tend to be the best source if you can get your hands on them.
Great. And then a couple more questions. So what can we do to protect the bears that are still around? Is that a question you can talk about?
In spending a lot of time studying bears from all their remains and picking up skulls with bullet holes, I just want to echo what Pete said. It's not a matter of habitat or climate change. A lot of it's really us and our choices and our actions, whether that's, trying to have certain policies to protect bears as they move in between protected areas, whether that's what products you choose to buy and thinking about like animal agriculture in the US. There's many different ways that human actions directly or indirectly impact these species, especially large carnivores. So it really is human action is what it comes down to.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for staying up late and doing this presentation. It was really, really fascinating. And yeah. Okay, I'm going to say goodnight to you, Alexis, and then bring back Lynn.
Hi.
Hello.
My windows just moved, sorry. This is us being live. Thanks, Rebekah, Moe, Pete, and Alexis for all your presentations tonight. It was fascinating, and I think we all learned a lot. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. Next week, we're bringing back our annual Women in Science event to Night School. So to mark International Women's Day, we're handing over the mic to a panel of accomplished scientists. Ali Ward of the podcast Ologies will also join us to lead some conversations about what it's like to be a woman in science in 2021.
I also wanted to do a plug. If you loved Moe and her presentation, we're actually doing a gray whale themed night school at the end of March. So come back and hear Moe talk about whales. Yeah, she knows a lot. So anyway. And then that reminds me, so you don't miss that, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss a night school. And, like I've been saying this every week, but the Academy is still unfortunately closed. So we do have a link to a place where you can donate if you have the means, if you feel like it. We just really love having you here every week. And also Lynn just wanted me to tell you that there's also a night school about wolves in a couple weeks, because we saw some people on the 11th, because we saw people talking about wolves in the chat. So subscribe and come back then. But yeah, thank you again so much, and we'll see you next week.